Hello, 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 greetings, salutations, konnichiwa, and every other form of green across this vast, marvelous multiverse. I am Matsu Quinox. This is Horace, and welcome back, my dear, marvelous, wonderful scholars, to the study. Hello there, all my wonderful, dear, marvelous scholars, wherever you are, whenever you are. Oh, hello there, Private Maverick. Welcome, surprise stream. Basically, yes. I'll explain in a little bit. Hello there, scholars, one and all, from all across the multiverse. Back to the study. It's good to be back here. It's good to be here in any form. Um, as you might notice, this is a little unusual for me. Hmm. Matsu streaming on a Sunday? What is this? This is insane. Pandemonium. Dogs and cats living together, all that sort of thing. So the reason for this basically boils down to this. I'm going on a journey starting Friday, Thursday, Friday. And I felt, I felt really bad just doing one stream on a Tuesday. So I thought, well, how about I move my usual reading stream to Sunday instead? Hmm. So here we are. I hope you're all doing well, my wonderful scholars. I myself have had a mm, let's put it mildly, a very frustrating morning. Nothing seemed to go right. I was really, really angry. Um, Thankfully, Horace managed to calm me down, but yeah, it was very harrowing, and it's that sort of thing of exactly what you would expect. But still, for tonight, anyway, I thought, where am I going with this? Horace, where am I going with this? Oh, yes, what we're doing tonight. Oh, hello there, Julian20. Welcome. So tonight we are doing some more reading of spooky stories. In fact, we are going to be reading from one of my favorite authors, M.R. James, a man who wrote many a spooky, scary, ghostly tale. And well, I can't resist a ghostly, spooky tale. So we'll read a few of them tonight. I'm excited. I hope you're excited too, my dear scholars. Um, but yes. Anyway, how are all of you who are here doing? Are you doing well? I'm curious. I hope you're doing well at least. Well, I'll assume you're doing well. That's the least I can do. So anyway, without further ado, I suppose we should get on with the stories. Private Maverick, I'm doing all right so far. Good. Doing all right is excellent. Yeah, as you can tell, I'm a little bit off my game. Oh, my mind is all over the place. But yes, we will, I think, dive right into some spooky, scary stories. Now, the interesting thing about these stories is they were originally meant to be read. They were read out loud by M.R. James originally at the Christmas parties he would put on at, I think it was, where was it? Was it Cambridge? Yes, at King's College, Cambridge, where he taught. But these were meant to be read, and so often these stories have been adapted many a time in many a media, several times for television, especially by the BBC. In fact, their program A Ghost Story at Christmas oftentimes adapts one of his stories for that. But anyway, again, I digress. My dear scholars, shall we begin our tales of terrifying spookiness? And that sounded really bad. Shall we dive right into the stories, is what I mean to say. I'm looking at these and I'm so excited to read them. Julian, Private Maverick, let's go. Yes, let's go. Oh my goodness. So then, my dear scholars, sit back, relax, have a hot or cold beverage of your liking, dim the lights, and we will begin our reading of some of the ghostly tales of M.R. James. A warning to the curious. The place on the east coast, which the reader is asked to consider, is Seaborough. It is not very different now from what I remember it to have been when I was a child. Marshes intersected by dikes to the south, recalling the early chapters of Great Expectations. Flat fields to the north, merging into heath, fir woods, and above all, gorse inland. A lawn sea-front and a street. Behind that a spacious church of flint, with a broad, solid western tower, and a peal of 6 bells. How well I remember their song on a hot Sunday in August, as our party went slowly up the white, dusty slope of the road toward them, for the church stands at the top of a short, steep incline. They rang with a flat, clacking sort of sound of those on those hot days, but when the air was softer, they were mellower too. The railway ran down to its little terminus farther down the same road. There was a gay white windmill just before you came to the station, and another down near the shingle at the south end of the town, and yet others on higher ground to the roof. Oh, hello there, Dr. Zadium. Welcome. Glad to have you here. We are just starting our reading of A Warning to the Curious. There were cottages of bright red brick with slate roofs. But why do I encumber you with these commonplace details? The fact is that they come crowding to the point of the pencil when it begins to write of Seaborough. I should like to be sure that I had allowed the right ones to get on the paper, but I forgot. I have not quite done with the word painting business yet. Walk away from the sea and the town, past the station, and turn up the road on the right. It is a sandy road, parallel with the railway, and if you follow it, it climbs to somewhat higher ground. On your left, you are now going northward, is heath. On your right, the side toward the sea, is a belt of old firs, wind-beaten, thick at the top, with the slope that old seaside trees have. With that, yeah, with the slope that old seaside trees have. Seen on the skyline from the train, they would tell you in an instant, if you did not know it, that you were approaching a windy coast. Well, at the top of my little hill, a line of these firs strikes out and runs towards the sea, for there is a ridge that goes that way, and the ridge ends in a rather well-defined mound, commanding the level fields of rough grass, and a little knot of fir trees crowns it. And here you may sit on a hot spring day, very well content to look at blue sea, white windmills, red cottages, bright green grass church tower, and distant Martello Tower on the south. As I have said, I began to know Seaborough as a child, but a gap of a good many years separates my early knowledge from that which is more recent. Still, it keeps its place in my affections, and any tales of it that I pick up have an interest for me. One such tale is this. It came to me in a place very remote from Seaborough, and quite accidentally, from a man whom I had been able to oblige, enough in his opinion to justify his making me his confidant in this extent. I know all that country more or less, he said. I used to go to Seaborough pretty regularly for golf in the spring. I generally put up at the Bear with a friend. Henry Lawn it was. You knew him, perhaps? Slightly. I said. And we used to take a sitting room and be very happy there. Since he died, I haven't cared to go there. And I don't know that I should anyhow after the particular thing that happened on our last visit. It was April 19th. We were there, and by some chance we were almost the only people in the hotel. So the ordinary public rooms were practically empty, and we were the more surprised when, after dinner, our sitting room door opened, and a young man put his head in. We were aware of this young man. He was rather a rabbity mimic subject, light hair and light eyes, but not unpleasing. So when he said, "I beg your pardon, is this a private room?" we did not growl and say, "Yes, it is." But Lon said, or I did, no matter which, "Please come in." "Oh, may I?" he said, and seemed relieved. Of course, it was obvious that he wanted company, and as he was a reasonable kind of person, not the sort to bestow his whole family history on you, we urged him to make himself at home. "I dare say you find the other rooms rather bleak," I said. Yes, he did, but it was really too good of us, and so on. That being got over, he made some pretense of reading a book. Lon was playing patience. I was writing. It became plain to me after a few minutes that this visitor of ours was in rather a state of fidgets, or nerves, which communicated itself to me, and so I put away my writing and turned to at engaging him in talk. After some remarks, which I forget, he became rather confidential. "You'll think it's very odd of me," this was the sort of way he began, "but the fact is I've had something of a shock." Well, I recommended a drink of some cheering kind, and we had it. The waiter coming in made an interruption, and I thought our young man seemed very jumpy when the door opened, but after a while he got back to his woes again. There was nobody he knew in the place, and he did happen to know who we both were. It turned out there was some common acquaintance in town. And really, he did want a word of advice, if we didn't mind. Of course, we both said, "By all means," or "Not at all," and Lon put away his cards. And we settled down to hear what his difficulty was. "It began," he said, "more than a week ago, when I bicycled over to Foston, only about 5 or 6 miles, to see the church. I'm very much interested in architecture, and it's got one of those pretty porches with niches and shields. I took a photograph of it, and then an old man who was tying up the churchyard came and asked if I'd care to look into the church. I said yes, and he produced a key and let me in. There wasn't much inside, but I told him it was a nice little church, and he kept it very clean. But, I said, the porch is the best part of it. We were just outside the porch then, and he said, "Ah, that is a nice porch. And do you know, sir, what's the meaning of that coat of arms there?" It was the one with the three crowns, and though I'm not much of a herald, I was able to say, "Yes, I thought it was the old arms of the kingdom of East Anglia." "That's right, sir," he said. "And do you know the meaning of them three crowns that's on it?" I said I'd no doubt it was known, but I couldn't recollect to have heard it myself. "Well, then," he said, "for all you're a scholard, I can tell you something you don't know. Them's the three only crowns that was buried in the ground near by the coast to keep the Germans from landing. I can see you don't believe that, but I tell you, if it hadn't have been for one of them holy crowns being there still, them Germans would have landed here time and again. They would. Landed with their ships and killed man, woman, and child in their beds. Now then, that's the truth what I'm telling you. That is. And if you don't believe me, you ask the rector. There he comes. You asked him, I says." Julian 20. Oh, this story's so scary. Oh, you know this story. Interesting. I look forward to hearing what you think of it at the end. I looked around, and there was the rector, a nice looking old man coming up the path. And before I could begin assuring my old man, who was getting quite excited, that I didn't disbelieve him, the rector struck in and said, "What's this all about? What's all this about, John? Good day to you, sir. Have you been looking at our little church?" So then there was a little talk which allowed the old man to calm down, and then the rector asked him again what was the matter. What was the matter? "Oh," he said, "it warn't nothing, think. Only I was telling this gentleman he ought to ask you about them holy crowns." "Ah, yes, to be sure," said the rector. "There's a very curious matter, isn't it? But I don't know whether the gentleman is interested in our old stories, eh?" "Oh, he'll be interested fast enough," says the old man. "He'll put his confidence in what you tells him, sir. Why, you known William Agar yourself, father and son too." Then I put in a word to say how much I should like to hear all about it, and before many minutes I was walking up the village street with the rector, who had one or two words to say to parishioners, and then to the rectory, where he took me into his study. He had made out on the way that I really was capable of taking an intelligent interest in a piece of folklore, and not quite the ordinary tripper. So he was very willing to talk. And it is rather surprising to me that the particular legend he told me has not made its way into print before. His account of it was this: "There has always been a belief in these parts in the three holy crowns. The old people say they were buried in different places near the coast to keep off the Danes or the French or the Germans, and they say that one of the three was dug up a long time ago, and another has disappeared by the encroaching of the sea, and one's still left doing its work, keeping off invaders. Well now, if you have read the ordinary guides and histories of this country, you will remember perhaps that in 1687 a crown, which was said to be the crown of Redwald, king of the East Angles, was dug up at Rendlesham, and alas, melted down before it was even properly described or drawn. Well, Rendlesham isn't on the coast, but it isn't so very far inland, and it's on a very important line of access, and I believe that is the crown which the people mean when they say that one has been dug up. Then on the south, you don't want me to tell you where there was a Saxon royal palace which is now under the sea, eh? Well, there was the second crown, I take it, and up beyond these two, they say, lies the third." "Do they say where it is?" Of course I asked. He said, "Yes, indeed they do, but they don't tell." And his manner did not encourage me to put the obvious question. Instead of that, I waited a moment and said, "What did the old man mean when he said you knew William Agar? As if that had something to do with the crowns." Get another little drink. "Oh, to be sure," he said. "Now there's another curious story. These Agars, it's a very old name in these parts, but I can't find that were ever people of quality or big owners. These Agars say, or said, that their branch of the family were the guardians of the last crown. A certain old Nathaniel Agar was the first one, I believe, first one I knew. I was born and brought up quite near here, and he, I believe, camped out at the place during the whole of the War of 1870. William, his son, did the same, I know, during the South African War. And young William, his son, who has only died fairly recently, took lodgings at the college nearest the spot, and I've no doubt hastened his end, for he was a consumptive by exposure and night watching, and he was the last of that branch. It was a dreadful grief to him to think that he was the last, but he could do nothing. The only relations at all near to him were in the colonies, I wrote letters for him to them, imploring them to come over on business very important to the family. But there has been no answer. So, the last of the Holy Crowns, if it's there, has no guardian now. That's what the rector told me, and you can fancy how interesting I found it. The only thing I could think of when I left him was how to hit upon the spot where the crown was supposed to be. I wished I'd left it alone. But there was a sort of fate in it, for I bicycled back past the churchyard wall, my eye caught a fairly new gravestone, and on it was the name of William Agar. Of course I got off and read it. It said, "Of this parish died at Seaburn, 19 blank, aged 28." There it was, you see. Excuse me. A little duteous questioning in the right place, and I should at least find the cottage nearest the spot. Only I didn't quite know what was the right place to begin my question yet. Again, there was fate. It took me to the curiosity shop down that way, you know, and I turned over some old books, and if you please, one was a prayer book of 1740 odd, in a rather handsome binding. I'll just go and get it. It's in my room. He left us in a state of some surprise, but we had hardly time to exchange any remarks when he was back, panting and handing us the book, opened at the flyleaf on which was, in a straggly hand, "Nathan Agar is my name, and England is my nation. Seaborough is my dwelling place, and Christ is my salvation. When I am dead and in my grave, and all my bones are rotten, I hope the Lord will think on me when I am quite forgotten." This poem was dated 1754, and there was many more entries of Agars, Nathaniel, Frederick, William, and so on, ending with William, 19 blank. "You see," he said, "anybody would call it the greatest bit of luck. I did, but I don't know." Of course I asked the shopman about William Agar, and of course he happened to remember that he lodged in a cottage in the North Field and died there. This was just chalking the road for me. I knew which the cottage must be. There's only one sizable one about there. The next thing was to scrape some sort of acquaintance with the people, and I took a walk that way at once. A dog did the business for me. He made at me so fiercely that they had to run out and beat him off, and then naturally begged my pardon, and we got into talk. I had only to bring up Agar's name and pretend I knew, or thought I knew something of him, and then the woman said how sad it was him dying so young, and she was sure it came off him spending the night out of doors in the cold weather. Then I had to say, "Did he go out on the sea at night?" And she said, "Oh no, it was on the hillock yonder with the trees on it." And there it was. I know something about digging in these burrs. I've opened many of them in the down country, but that was with owner's leave, and in broad daylight, and with men to help. I had to prospect very carefully here before I put a spade in. I couldn't trench across the mound, and with those old firs growing there, I knew there would be awkward tree roots. Still, the soil was very light and sandy and easy, and there was a rabbit hole or so that might be developed into a sort of tunnel. The going out and coming back at odd hours to the hotel was going to be the awkward part. When I made up my mind about the way to excavate, I told the people that I was called away for a night. I spent it out there. I made my tunnel. I won't bore you with the details of how I supported and filled it in when I'm done, but the main thing is that I got the crown. Naturally, we both broke out into explanations of surprise and interest. I, for one, had long known about the finding of the crown at Rendlesham, and had often lamented its fate. No one has ever seen an Anglo-Saxon crown, at least no one had. But our man gazed at us with a rueful eye. "Yes," he said, And the worst of it is, I don't know how to put it back. Put it back? We cried out. Why, my dear sir, you've made one of the most exciting finds ever heard of in this country. Of course it ought to go to the jewel house at the tower. What's your difficulty? If you're thinking about the owner of the land and treasure trove and all that, we can certainly help you through. Nobody's going to make a fuss about technicalities in a case of this kind. Probably more was said, but all he did was to put his face in his hands and mutter, I don't know how to put it back. At last Lon said, You'll forgive me, I hope, if I seem impertinent, but are you quite sure you've got it? I was waiting to ask much the same question myself, for of course the story did seem a lunatic's dream when one thought over it. But I hadn't quite dared to say what might hurt the poor young man's feelings. However, he took it quite calmly, really with the calm of despair, you might say. He sat up and said, Oh, yes, there's no doubt of that. I have it here, in my room, locked up in my bag. You can come and look at it if you'd like. I won't offer to bring it here. We were not likely to let the chance slip. We went with him. His room was only a few doors off. The boots were just collecting shoes. The boots were just collecting shoes in the passage, or so we thought. Afterwards, we were not sure. Our visitor, his name was Paxton, was in a worse state of shivers than before, and went hurriedly into the room, and beckoned us after, turned on the light, and shut the door carefully. Then he unlocked his kit bag, and produced a bundle of clean pocket handkerchiefs in which something was wrapped, laid it on the bed, and undid it. I can now say I have seen an actual Anglo-Saxon crown. It was of silver, as the Rendlesham one is always said to have been. It was set with some gems, mostly antique intaglios and cameos, and it was of rather plain, almost rough workmanship. In fact, it was like those you see on the coins and in the manuscripts. I found no reason to think it was later than the 9th century. I was intently interested, of course, and wanted to turn it over in my hands, but Paxton prevented me. Don't you touch it, he said. I'll do that. And with a sigh that was, I declare to you, dreadful to hear, he took it up and turned it about so that we could see every part of it. Seen enough? He said at last, and we nodded. He wrapped it up and locked it in his bag, and stood looking at us dumbly. Come back to our room, Lon said, and tell us what the trouble is. He thanked us and said, Will you go first and see if the coast is clear? That wasn't very intelligible, for our proceedings hadn't been, after all, very suspicious, and the hotel, I said, was practically empty. However, we were beginning to have inklings of we didn't know what, and anyhow nerves are infectious. So we did go, first peering out as we opened the door, and fancying, I found we both had the fancy, that a shadow, or more than a shadow, but it made no sound, passed from before us to one side as we came out into the passage. It's all right, we whispered to Paxton. Whispering seemed the proper tone, and we went with him between us back to our sitting room. I was preparing, when we got there, to be ecstatic about the unique interest of what we had seen. But when I looked at Paxton, I saw that would be terribly out of place, and I left it to him to begin. What is to be done? Was his opening. Lon thought it right, as he explained to me afterwards, to be obtuse, and said, "Why not find out who the owner of the land is, and inform—" "Oh, no, 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 no." Paxton broke in impatiently. "I beg your pardon. You've been very kind, but don't you see it's got to go back? And I daren't be there at night. Daytime's impossible. Perhaps, though, you don't see. Well, then the truth is that I've never been alone since I touched it." I was beginning some fairly stupid comment, but Lon caught my eye and I stopped. Lon said, "I think I do see, perhaps. But wouldn't it be a relief to tell us a little more clearly what the situation is?" Then it all came out. Paxton looked over his shoulder and beckoned to us to come nearer to him, and began speaking in a low voice. We listened most intently, of course, and compared notes afterwards, and I wrote down our version, so I am confident I have what he told us almost word for word. He said, "It began when I was first prospecting, and put me off again and again. There were there was always somebody, a man, standing by one of the firs. This was in daylight, you know. He was never in front of me. I always saw him with the tail of my eye on the left or the right, and he was never there when I looked straight for him. I would lie down for quite a long time and take careful observations, and make sure there was no one. And then when I got up and began prospecting again, there he was." And he began to give me hints besides, for wherever I put that prayer book, short of locking it up, which I did at last, when I came back to my room, it was always out of my table, open at the flyleaf, where the names are, and one of my razors across it to keep it open. I'm sure he just can't open my bag, or something more would have happened. You see, he's light and weak, but all the same I daren't face him. Well, then, when I was making the tunnel, of course it was worse, and if I hadn't been so keen, I should have dropped the whole thing and run. It's like someone scraping at my back all the time. I thought for a long time it was only the soil dropping on me, but as I got near the crown, it was unmistakable. And when I actually laid it bare and got my fingers into the ring of it, pulled it out, oh, came a sort of cry behind me. Oh, I can't tell you how desolate it was, and horribly threatening too. It spoilt all my pleasures in my field, in my find. Cut it off that moment. If I hadn't been the wretched fool I am, I should have put the thing back and left it. But I didn't. The rest of the time was just awful. I had hours to get through before I could decently come back to the hotel. First I spent time filling my tunnel and covering my tracks, and all the while he was there, trying to thwart me. Sometimes, you see him, and sometimes you don't, just as he pleases. I think I think he's there, but he has some power over your eyes. Well, I wasn't off the spot very long before sunrise, and then I had to get to the junction for Seaburg and take a train back. And though it was daylight fairly soon, I don't know if that made it much better. There were always hedges or gorse bushes, or park fences along the road, some sort of cover, I mean. And I was never easy for a second. And then when I began to meet people going to work, they always looked behind me very strangely. It might have been that they were surprised I'd seen anyone so early, but I didn't think it was only that. And I don't know. They didn't look exactly at me. And the porter of the train was like that too, and the guard held open the door after I'd got into the carriage, just as he would if there was somebody else coming, you know. Oh, you may be very sure it isn't my fancy, he said with a dull sort of laugh. Then he went on. And even if I do get it put back, he won't forgive me. I can tell that. And I was so happy. A fortnight ago. He dropped into a chair, and I believe he began to cry. We didn't know what to say, but we felt we must come to the rescue somehow. And so, it really seemed the only thing. We said if he was so set on putting the crown back in its place, we would help him. And I must say that after what we had heard, it did seem the right thing. If these horrid consequences had come on this poor man, might there not really be something in the original idea of the crown having some curious power bound with it to guard the coast? At least that was my feeling, and I think it was Lon's too. Our offer was very welcome to Paxton anyhow. When could we do it? It was nearing 10:30. Could we contrive to make a late walk plausible to the hotel people that very night? We looked out of the window. There was a brilliant full moon, the Paschal moon. Lon undertook to tackle the boots and propitiate him. He used to say that we should not be much over the hour, and if we did find it so pleasant that we stopped over a bit longer, we would see that he didn't lose by sitting up. Well, we were pretty regular customers at the hotel and did not give much trouble, and we were considered by the servants to be not under the mark in the way of tips. And so the boots was propitiated, and led us out onto the sea front, and remained, as we heard later, looking after us. Paxton had a large coat over his arm, under which was the wrapped-up crown. So, we were off on this strange errand before we had time to think how very much out of the way it was. I have told this part quite shortly on purpose, for it really does represent the haste with which we settled our plan and took action. "The shortest way is up the hill and through the churchyard," Paxton said as we stood a moment before the hotel looking up and down the front. There was nobody about. Nobody at all. Seaborough out of the season is early. Quiet place. Excuse me, my dear scholars. "We can't go along the dike by the cottage because of the dog," Paxton also said, which I pointed to what I thought was a shorter when I pointed to what I thought was a shorter way along the front and across 2 fields. The reason he gave was good enough. We went up the road to the church and turned in at the churchyard gate. I confess to having thought that there might be some lying there who might be conscious of our business. Let me read that again. I confess to having thought that there might be some lying there who might be conscious of our business. But if it was so, they were also conscious that one who was on their side, so to say, had us under surveillance, and we saw no sign of them. But under observation we felt we were. So I have never felt it at another time, as I have never felt it another time. Especially was it so when we passed out of the churchyard into a narrow path with close, high hedges, through which we hurried as Christian did through that valley, and so got out into open fields. Then along hedges, though I would sooner have been in the open where I could see if anyone was visible behind me, over a gate or two, and then a swerve to the left, taking us up on to the ridge which ended in that mound. As we neared it, Henry Lawn felt, and I felt too, that there were what I can only call dim presences waiting for us, as well as a far more actual one attending us. Of Paxton's agitation all this time I can give you no adequate picture. He breathed like a hunted beast, and we could not either of us look at his face. How he would manage when we got to the very place we had not troubled to think. He had seemed so sure that there would not be difficult. Nor was it. I never saw anything like the dash with which he flung himself at a particular spot in the side of the mound, and tore at it, so that in a very few minutes the greater part of his body was out of sight. We stood holding the coat and that bundle of handkerchiefs and looking very fearfully, I must admit, about us. There was nothing to be seen. A line of dark firs behind us made one skyline. More trees and the church tower half a mile off on the right. Cottages and a windmill on the horizon on the left. Calm sea dead in front. Faint barking of a dog at a cottage on a gleaming dike between us and it. Full moon making that path we know across the sea. The eternal whisper of the Scotch firs just above us, and of the sea in front. Yet in all this quiet, in in our acrid consciousness of restrained hostility, very near us, like a dog on a leash that might be let go at any moment. Paxton pulled himself out of the hole and stretched a hand back to us. "Give it to me," he whispered. "Unwrapped." We pulled off the handkerchiefs and he took the crown. The moonlight just fell on it as he snatched it. We had not ourselves touched that bit of metal, and I have thought since that it was just as well. In another moment Paxton was out of the hole again and busy shoveling back the soil with hands that were already bleeding. He would have none of our help, though. It was much the longest part of the job to get the place to look undisturbed. Yet, I don't know how, he made a wonderful success of it. At last he was satisfied, and we turned back. We were a couple of 100 yards from the hill when Lon suddenly said to him, "I say, you've left your coat there. That won't do, see?" And I certainly did see it. The lawn dark overcoat lying where the tunnel had been. Paxton had not stopped, however. He only shook his head and held up the coat on his arm. And when we joined him, he said without any excitement, but as if nothing mattered any more, "That wasn't my coat." And indeed, when we looked back again, that dark thing was not to be seen. Another drink. Really? Well, we got out on the road and came rapidly back that way. It was well before 12 when we got in, trying to put a good face on it, and saying, Lon and I, what a lovely night it was for a walk. The Boots was on the lookout for us, and we made remarks like that for his edification as we entered the hotel. He gave another look up and down the sea-front before we locked the front door, and said, "You didn't meet many people about, I suppose, sir?" "No, indeed, not a soul," I said, at which I remembered Paxton looking oddly at me. "Only, I thought I see someone turn up the station road after you gentlemen," said the boots. "Still, you was three together, and I don't suppose he meant mischief." I didn't know what to say. Lon merely said, "Good night," and we went off upstairs, promising to turn out all lights and to go to bed in a few minutes. Back in our room, we did our very best to make Paxton take a cheerful view. "There's the crown back again. There's the crown safe back," we said. "Very likely you'd have done better not to touch it," and he heavily assented to that. "But no real harm has been done, and we shall never give this away to anyone who would be so mad as to go near it. Besides, don't you feel better yourself? I don't mind confessing," I said, "that on the way there I was very much inclined to take your view about being followed. But going back, it wasn't at all the same thing, was it?" No, it wouldn't do. "You've got nothing to trouble yourselves about," he said, "but I'm not forgiven. I've got to pay for that miserable sacrilege still. I know what you are going to say. The church might help. Yes, it's the body that has to suffer. I'm it's true I'm not feeling that he's waiting outside for me just now, but—" Then he stopped. Then he turned to thanking us, and we put him off as soon as we could. And naturally, we pressed him to use our sitting room next day, and said we should be glad to go out with him. Or did he play golf, perhaps? Yes, he did. But he didn't think he should care about that tomorrow. Well, we recommended him to get up late and sit in our room in the morning while we were playing, and we should have a walk later in the day. He was very submissive and piano about it all, ready to do just what we thought best, but clearly quite certain in his own mind that what was coming could not be averted or palliated. You'll wonder why we didn't insist on accompanying him to his home and seeing him safe in the care of brothers or someone. The fact was, he had nobody. He had had a flat in town, but lately he had made up his mind to settle for a time in Sweden, and he had dismantled his flat and shipped off his belongings, and was whiling away a fortnight or 3 weeks before he made a start. Anyhow, we didn't see what we could do better than sleep on it, or not sleep very much, as was my case, and see what we felt like tomorrow morning. We felt very different, Lon and I, on as beautiful an April morning as you could desire. And Paxton also looked very different when we saw him at breakfast. "The first approach to a decent night I seem ever to have had," was what he said. But he was going to do as we had settled, stay in probably all the morning and come out with us later. We went to the links. We met some other men and played with them in the morning, and had lunch there rather early, so as not to be late back. All the same, the snares of death overtook him. Drink. Whether it could have been prevented, I don't know. I think he would have been got at somehow, do what we might. Anyhow, this is what happened. We went straight up to our room. Paxton was there reading quite peacefully. "Ready to come out shortly?" said Lon. "Say, in half an hour's time?" "Certainly," he said, and I said we would change first, and perhaps have baths, and call for him in half an hour. I had my bath first, and went and lay down on my bed, and slept for about 10 minutes. We came out of our rooms at the same time, and went together to the sitting room. Paxton wasn't there, only his book. Nor was he in his room, nor in the downstairs rooms. We shouted for him. A servant came out and said, Oh, I thought you gentlemen was gone out already, and so did the other gentleman. He heard you calling from the path there. I run out in a hurry, and I looked out at the coffee room window, but I didn't see you. However, he run off down the beach that way." Without a word, we ran that way too. It was the opposite direction of that of last night's expedition. It wasn't quite 4 o'clock, and the day was fair, though not so fair as it had been, so there was really no reason, you'd say, for anxiety. With people about, surely a man couldn't come to much harm. But something in our look as we ran out must have struck the servant, for she came out on the steps and pointed and said, "Yes, that's the way he came. That's the way he went." We ran on as far as the top of the shingle bank, and then pulled up. There was a choice of ways: past the houses on the seafront or along the sand at the bottom of the beach, which, the tide being now out, was fairly broad. Or, of course, we might keep along the shingle between these two tracks and have some view of both of them. Only that was heavy going. We chose the sand, for that was the loneliest, and someone might come to harm there without being seen from the public path. Lon said he saw Paxton some distance ahead, running and waving his stick as if he wanted to signal to people who were on ahead of him. I couldn't be sure. One of these sea mists were coming up very quickly from the south. There was someone. That's all I could say. And there were tracks on the sand as of someone running who wore shoes. And there were other tracks made before those, for the shoes sometimes trod in them and interfered with them, of someone not in shoes. Oh, of course, it's only my word you've got to take for all this. Lon's dead. We'd no time or means to make sketches or take casts, and the next tide washed everything away. All we could do was to notice these marks as we hurried on. But there they were over and over again, and we had no doubt what we saw was the track of a bare foot, and one that showed more bones than flesh. The notion of Paxton running after anything like this, and supposing it to be the friends he was looking for, was very dreadful to us. You can guess what we fancied: how the thing he was following might stop suddenly and turn round on him, and what sort of face it would show, half seen at first in the mist, which all the while was getting thicker and thicker, as I ran on wondering how the poor wretch could have been lured into mistaking that other thing for us. I remembered his saying, "He has some power over your eyes." And then I wondered what the end would be, for I had no hope now that the end could be averted. And, well, there is no need to tell all the dismal and horrid thoughts that flirted through my head as we ran on into the mist. It was uncanny, too, that the sun should still be bright in the sky and we could see nothing. We could only tell that we were now past the houses and had reached that gap there is between them and the old Martello Tower. When you are past the tower, you know there is nothing but shingle for a long way. Not a house, not a human creature, just that spit of land, or rather shingle, with the river on your right and the sea on your left. But just before that, just by the Martello Tower, you remember there is the old battery close to the sea. I believe there are only a few blocks of concrete left now. The rest has all been washed away, but at this time there was a lot more, though the place was a ruin. Well, we got there. We clambered to the top as quickly as we could take a breath and look over the shingle in front if by chance the mist would let us see anything. But a moment's rest we must have. We had run a mile at least. Nothing whatever was visible ahead of us. We were just turning by common consent to get down and run hopelessly on when we heard what I can only call a laugh. if I and if you can understand what I mean by a breathless, a lungless laugh, you have it. But I don't suppose you can. It came from below and swerved away into the mist. That was enough. We bent over the wall. Paxton was there at the bottom. You don't need to be told that he was dead. His tracks showed that he had run along the edge of the battery, had turned sharp round the corner of it, and smoled out of it. Must have dashed straight into the open arms of someone who was waiting there. His mouth was full of sand and stones, and his teeth and jaws were broken to bits. I only glanced once at his face. At the same moment, just as we were scrambling down from the battery to get to the body, we heard a shout and saw a man running down the bank of the Martello Tower. He was the caretaker stationed there, and his keen old eyes had managed to descry through the mist that something was wrong. He had seen Paxton fall, and had seen us a moment after running up, and fortunate this, for otherwise we could hardly have escaped suspicion of being coerced in the dreadful business. Concerned in the dreadful business. Had he, we asked, caught sight of anybody attacking our friend? He could not be sure. We sent him off for help and stayed by the dead man till they came with a stretcher. It was then that we traced out how he had come, on the narrow fringe of sand under the battery wall. The rest was shingle, and it was hopelessly impossible to tell whither the other had gone. What were we to say at the inquest? It was a duty we felt not to give up, there in the secret of the crown, to be published in every paper. I don't know how much you would have told, but what we did agree upon was this: to say that we had only made acquaintance with Paxton the day before, and that he had told us he was under some apprehension of danger at the hands of a man called William Agar. Also that we had seen some other tracks besides Paxton's when we followed him along the beach. But of course, by that time, everything was gone from the sands. No one had any knowledge, fortunately, of any William Agar living in the district. The evidence of the man at the Martello Tower freed us from all suspicion. All that could be done was to return a verdict of willful murder by some person or persons unknown. Paxton was so totally without connections that all the inquiries that were subsequently made ended in a no thoroughfare, and I have never been at Seaborough, or even near it, since. Whew. So, lesson learned. Don't dig up any ancient Anglo-Saxon crowns, my dear scholars. So then, let's see. But yes, that was Warning to the Curious, which was adapted for A Ghost Story for Christmas. Incidentally, when it was adapted, they made quite a few changes, especially changing Paxton from a man who just happened to become interested in the crown and basically let his curiosity get the better of him, to a man who was directly seeking the crown, which made him a little bit less sympathetic. probably have time for one more story, I think. So I think we will do a very famous one. Well, yes, why not? We'll do one more. This one is divided into parts. And I will absolutely butcher the beginning of this. So, my dear scholars, let us continue our nightly fear with the treasure of Abbot Thomas. Julian 20, Night of No Sleep. The treasure of Abbot Thomas. Give me 1 second. I just want to make sure something. Julian 20, have you read a lot of these M.R. James stories before? Huh, interesting. Oh, hello there, Ritsuka. Welcome. Hey, Matsu, just passing by to say good night. Ah, good night to you as well, Ritsuka. Have a good night. 1. Verum usque in pastentem diem multa grenunt unter se cognice de abscendito quodam istiam abitus Thomas therosurum quiam sapiam queriquiam ad hoc incessium quisverunt Steinfeldes ners, I cannot pronounce Latin to save my thing, epsum iam tomem adhun Florida in ater existiam ingriam orem massiam siras monasterium defodisse per hibent de quom molototes iteria quicus ube estis cum risu respondere solidas erat Job, Johannes et Zacharias vel vobas vel postrias indictabunt indectio aliquedo edicere se evitras minime investirium inter alihulos abatis opera hoc memoria principium dectum ediscio quod Venetium magnum in orientem pate ella Australias in excellias sua imagem Julian 20. Ah, yes, Latin. Yes, a lot of Latin. Imagibus optimum in vitro depictius imperverit id quod et ibicius effigies et insignia invidium posteros demonstratent dominum quotium abitalium fer totum restauravit potio in atrium ispius effusios et lapidabius memoriamus pulchre. I'm gonna break my tongue doing this. Calitus exornato decetis autum morte eloquentilium subitania persecuus aeteus sui anno LXXXII incarnationis vero Domini Dominicae MDXXXIX. I apologize to all Latin speakers if I completely wrecked that. Okay. Union 20. I took that in high school. Really interesting. I suppose I shall have to translate this, said the antiquarian to himself as he finished copying the above lines from that rather rare and exceedingly diffuse book, the Certum Stephen Feldestins Norbitium, or Norbitum. Well, it may as well be done first at last, as last. And accordingly, the following rendering was very quickly produced. Up to the present day there is much gossip among the canons about a certain hidden treasure of this Abbot Thomas, for which those of Steinfeld have often made search, though hereto in vain. The story of that is that Thomas, while yet in the vigor of life, concealed a very large quantity of gold somewhere in the monastery. He was often asked where it was, and always answered with a laugh, Job, John, and Zachariah will tell either of you or your successors. He sometimes added that he should feel no grudge against those who might find it. Among other works carried out by this abbot, I may specially mention his filling the great window at the east end of the south aisle of the church with figures admirably painted on glass, as his effigy and arms in the window attest. He also restored almost the whole of the abbot's lodging, and dug a well in the court of it, which he adorned with beautiful carvings in marble. He died rather suddenly in the 72nd year of his age, A.D. 1529. The object which the antiquary had before him at the moment was that of tracing the whereabouts of the painted windows of the Abbey church of Steinfeld. Steinfeld, yeah. Shortly after the Revolution, a very large quantity of painted glass made its way from the dissolved abbeys of Germany and Belgium to this country, and may now be seen adorning various of our parish churches, cathedrals, and private chapels. Steinfeld Abbey was among the most considerable of those involuntary contributors to our artistic possessions. I am quoting the somewhat ponderous preamble of the book which the antiquary wrote. And the greater part of the glass from that institution can be identified without much difficulty by the help either of the numerous inscriptions in which the place is mentioned, or of the subjects of the windows, in which several well-defined cycles or narratives were represented. The passage with which I began my story had set the antiquary on the track of another identification. In a private chapel, no matter where, he had seen three large figures, each occupying a whole light in a window, and evidently the work of one artist. Their style made it plain that that artist had been a German of the 16th century, but hitherto the more exact localizing of them had been a puzzle. They represented, will you be surprised to hear it, Job Patriarchia, Johannes Evangelistia, Zacharias Prophetia, and each of these held a book or scroll inscribed with a sentence from his writings. There, as a matter of course, the antiquary had noted, and had been struck by the curious way in which they differed from any text of the Vulgate that he had been able to examine. Thus the scroll in Job's hand was inscribed, Aro est locus in quo abscodiritur, for conflitor. And that translates, my dear scholars, as there is a place for gold where it is hidden. On the book of John was Hebent in vestimentias suis scriptium quam nemo novet, for inventiono scriptum, the following words being taken from another verse. That translates as, they have on their raiment a writing which no man knoweth. And Zacharias had superlaptium undum septum oculi sunt, which alone of the three presents an unaltered text. Upon one stone are 7 eyes. A sad perplexity it had been to our investigators to think why these three personages should have been placed together in one window. There was no bond of connection between them, either historic, symbolic, or doctrinal, and you could only suppose that they must have formed part of a very large series of prophets and apostles, which might have filled, say, all the clerestory windows of some capacious church. But the passage from the Sertum had altered the situation by showing that the names of the actual personages represented in the glass now in Lord Chapel had been constantly on the lips of Abbot Thomas von Eschenhausen of Steinfeld, and this abbot had put up a painted window, probably about the year 1520, in the south aisle of his abbey church. It was no very wild conjecture that the three figures might have formed part of Abbot Thomas's offering. It was one which, moreover, could probably be confirmed or set aside by another careful examination of the glass. And as Mr. Somerton was a man of leisure, he set out on pilgrimage to the private chapel with very little delay. His conjecture was confirmed to the full. Not only did the style and technique of the glass suit perfectly with the date and place required, but in another window of the chapel he found some glass known to have been bought along with the figures, which contained the arms of Abbot Thomas von Eschenhausen. At intervals during his researches, Mr. Somerton had been haunted by the recollection of the gossip about the hidden treasure, and as he thought the matter over, it became more and more obvious to him that if the abbot meant anything by the enigmatical answer which he gave to his questioners, he must have meant that the secret was to be found somewhere in the window he had placed in the abbey church. It was undeniable, furthermore, that the first of the curiously selected texts on the scrolls in the window might be taken to have a reference to hidden treasure. Every feature, therefore, or mark which could possibly assist in elucidating the riddle, which he felt sure the abbot had set to posterity, he noted with scrupulous care, and returning to his Berkshire manor house, consumed many a pint of the midnight oil over his tracings and sketches. After 2 or 3 weeks, a day came when Mr. Somerton announced to his man that he must pack his own and his master's things for a short journey abroad, whither for the moment we will not follow him. Another drink. 2. Mr. Gregory, the rector of Parsbury, had strolled out before breakfast, it being a fine autumn morning, as far as the gate of his carriage drive, with intent to meet the postman and sniff the cool air. Nor was he disappointed of either purpose. Before he had had time to answer more than 10 or 11 of the miscellaneous questions propounded to him in the lightness of their hearts by his young offspring, who had accompanied him, the postman was seen approaching, and among the morning's budget was one letter bearing a foreign postmark and stamp, which became at once the objects of an eager competition among the youthful Gregorys, and was addressed in an uneducated but plainly in English hand. When the rector opened it and turned to the signature, he realized it came from the confidential valet of his friend and squire, Mr. Somerton. Thus it ran: Honored Sir, as I am in a great anxiety about master, I write that is wish to beg you, sir, if you could be so good as step over. Master has had a nasty shock and keeps his bed. I never have known him like this, but no wonder, and nothing will serve but you, sir. Master says says would I mention the short way here is drive to Koblenz and take a trap. Hoping I have made all plain, but am much confused in myself, what with anxiety and wakefulness at night. If I might be so bold, sir, it will be a pleasure to see an honest British face among all these foreign ones. I am, sir, your obedient serve, William Brown. P.S. The village for town I will not term, it is named Steinfeld. The reader must be left to picture to himself in detail the surprise, confusion, and hurry of preparation into which the recipient of such a letter would be likely to plunge a quiet Berkshire personage in the year of grace 1859. It is enough for me to say that a train to town was caught in the course of the day, and that Mr. Gregory was able to secure a cabin at the Antwerp boat and a place in the Coblentz train. Nor was it difficult to manage the transit from that centre to Steinfeld. I labor under a grave disadvantage as narrator of this story in that I have never visited Steinfeld myself, and that neither of the principal actors in the episode, from whom I derive my information, was able to give anything but a vague and rather dismal idea of its appearance. I gather that it is a small place, with a large church despoiled of its ancient fittings, a number of rather ruinous great buildings, mostly of the 17th century, surround this church, for the abbey, in common with most of those on the continent, was rebuilt in a luxurious fashion by its inhabitants at that period. It has not seemed to me worth while to lavish money on a visit to the place, for though it is probably far more attractive than either Mr. Somerton or Mr. Gregory thought it, there is evidently little, if anything, of first-rate interest to be seen, except perhaps one thing, which I should not care to see. The inn where the English gentleman and his servant were lodged is, or was, the only possible one in the village. Mr. Gregory was taken to it at once by his driver, and found Mr. Brown waiting at the door. Mr. Brown, a model when in his Berkshire home of the impassive whiskered race, who are known as confidential valets, was now egregious out of his element, in a light tweed suit, anxious, almost irritable, and plainly anything but master of the situation. His relief at the sight of the honest British face of his rector was unmeasured, but words to describe it were denied him. He could only say, "Well, I am pleased, I'm sure, sir, to see you. And so I'm sure, sir, will master." "How is your master, Brown?" Mr. Gregory eagerly put in. "I think he's better, sir, thank you, but he's had a dreadful time of it. I hope he's getting some sleep now, but what has been the matter? I couldn't make out from your letter. Was it an accident of any kind?" "Well, sir, I hardly know whether I better speak about it. Master was very particular he should be the one to tell you. There's no bones broke. That's one thing I'm sure we ought to be thankful." "What does the doctor say?" asked Mr. Gregory. They were by this time outside Mr. Somerton's bedroom door, and speaking in low tones. Mr. Gregory, who happened to be in front, was feeling for the handle, and chanced to run his fingers over the panels. Before Brown could answer, there was a terrible cry from within the room. "In God's name, who is that?" were the first words they heard. "Brown, is it?" "Yes, sir. Me, sir. And Mr. Gregory." Brown hastened to answer, and there was an audible groan of relief in reply. They entered the room, which was darkened against the afternoon sun, and Mr. Gregory saw with a shock of pity how drawn, how damp with drops of fear, was the usual calm face of his friend, who, sitting up in the curtained bed, stretched out a shaking hand to welcome him. "Better for see better for seeing you, my dear Gregory," was the reply to the rector's first question, and it was palpably true. Another drink of water. After 5 minutes of conversation, Mr. Somerton was more his own man, Brown afterwards reported, than he had been for days. He was able to eat a more than respectable meal, and talked confidently of being fit to stand a journey to Kobolitz within 24 hours. But there's one thing, he said with a return of agitation which Mr. Gregory did not like to see, which I must beg you to do for me, my dear Gregory. Don't, he went on, laying his hand on Gregory's to forestall any interruption. Don't ask me what it is, or why I want it done. I'm not up to explain it yet. It would throw me back, undo all the good you have done me by coming. The only word I would say about it is that you run no risk whatever by doing it, and that Brown can and will show you tomorrow what it is. It's merely to put it back, to keep something. No, I can't speak of it yet. Do you mind calling Brown? Well, Somerton, said Mr. Gregory as he crossed the room to the door, I won't ask for any explanations till you see fit to give them. If this bit of business is as easy as you represent it to be, I will very gladly undertake it for you the first thing in the morning. Oh, I was sure you would, my dear Gregory. I was certain I could rely on you. I shall owe you more thanks than I can tell. Now here's Brown. Brown, one word with you. Shall I go? Not at all. Dear me, no. Brown, the first thing tomorrow morning. Yes, you don't mind early hours, I know, Gregory. You must take the rector to there. You know. A nod from Brown, who looked grave and anxious. And he and you will put that back. You needn't be in the least alarmed. It's perfectly safe in the daytime. You know what I mean. It lies on the step, you know, where we put it. Brown swallowed dryly once or twice, and failing to speak, bowed. And yes, that's all. Only this one other word, my dear Gregory. If you can manage to keep from questioning Brown about this matter, I shall be still more bound to you. Tomorrow evening at latest, it all goes well. If all goes well, I shall be able, I believe, to tell you the whole story from start to finish. Now, I'll wish you good night. Brown will be with me. He sleeps here. And if I were you, I should lock my door. Yes, be particular to do that. They like it, the people here, and it's better. Good night. Good night. They parted upon this, and if Mr. Gregory woke once or twice in the small hours and fancied he heard a fumbling about the lower part of his locked door, it was perhaps no more than what a quiet man, suddenly plunged into a strange bed in the heart of a mystery, might reasonably expect. Certainly, he thought to the end of his days he had heard such a sound twice or three times between midnight and dawn. He was up with the sun and out in company with Brown soon after. Perplexing as was the service he had been asked to perform for Mr. Somerton, it was not a difficult or an alarming one, and within half an hour from his leaving the inn it was over. What it was I shall not yet divulge. Later in the morning, Mr. Somerton, now almost himself again, was able to make a start from Steinfeld, and that same evening, whether at Koblenz or at some intermediate stage on the journey, I am not certain, he settled down to the promised explanation. Brown was present, but how much of the matter was ever really made plain to his comprehension he would never say, and I am unable to conjecture. 3. This was Mr. Somerton's story. You know roughly, both of you, that this expedition of mine was undertaken with the object of tracing something in connection with some old painted glass in Lord D.'s private chapel. Well, the starting point of the whole matter lies in this passage from an old printed book, to which I will ask your attention. And at this point, Mr. Somerton went carefully over some ground with which we were already familiar. On my second visit to the chapel, he went on, my purpose was to take every note I could of figures, lettering, diamond scratchings on the glass, and even apparently accidental markings. The first point which I tackled was that of the inscribed scrolls. I could not doubt that the first of these, that of Job, there is a place for the gold where it is hidden, with its intentional alteration, must refer to the treasure. So I applied myself with some confidence to the next, that of St. John. They have on their vestures a writing which no man knoweth. The natural question which have occurred to you, was there an inscription on the robes of the figures? I could see none. Each of the three had a broad black border to his mantle, which made a conspicuous and rather ugly feature in the window. I was nonplussed, I will own, and but for a curious bit of luck, I think I should have left the search where the canons of Steinfeld had left it before me. But I so happened that there was a good deal of dust on the surface of the glass, and Lord D, happening to come in, noticed my blackened hands, and kindly insisted on sending for a Turk's head broom to clean down the window. There must, I suppose, have been a rough piece in the broom. Anyhow, as it passed over the border of one of the mantles, I noticed that it left a long scratch, and that some yellow stain instantly showed up. I asked the man to stop his work for a moment, and ran up the ladder to examine the place. The yellow stain was there, sure enough, and what had come away was a thick black pigment, which had evidently been laid on with the brush after the glass had been burnt, and could therefore be easily scraped off without doing any harm. I scraped accordingly, and you will hardly believe... No, I do you an injustice. You will have guessed already that I found under this black pigment 2 or 3 clearly formed capital letters in yellow stain on a clear ground. Of course, I could hardly contain my delight. I told Lord D that I had detected an inscription which I thought might be very interesting, and begged to be allowed to uncover the whole of it. He made no difficulty about it whatever, told me to do exactly as I pleased, and then, having an engagement, was obliged, rather to my relief, I must say, to leave me. Excuse me. I set to work at once, and found the task a fairly easy one. The pigment, disintegrated, of course, by time, came off almost at a touch, and I don't think it took me a couple of hours, all told, to clean the whole of the black borders in all 3 lights. Each of the figures had, as the inscription says, a writing on the vestures which nobody knew. This discovery, of course, made it absolutely certain to my mind that while I was on the right track. And now what was the inscription? While I was cleaning the glass, I almost took pains not to read the lettering, save up the treat, until I had got the whole thing clear. And when that was done, my dear Gregory, I assure you I could almost have cried from sheer disappointment. What I read was only the most hopeless jumble of letters that was ever shaken up in a hat. Here it is. And here is what is written down, my dear scholars. Job, DrevimomsmvivlsmvibasbatAovt. St. John, RDIIAMRLESIPVSPODSEEIRSEETTAESGIAVNNR. And Zechariah, FTEAILNQDPVAIVMTLEEATTOHIOONVMCAAT dot H dot Q dot E dot. Blank as I felt and must have looked for the first few minutes, my disappointment didn't last long. I realized almost at once that I was dealing with a cipher, or cryptogram, and I reflected that I was likely to be of a pretty reflected that it was likely to be of a pretty simple kind, considering its early date. So I copied the letters with the most anxious care. Another little point I may tell you turned up in the process which confirmed my belief in the cipher. After copying the letters on Job's robe, I counted them to make sure that I had them right. There were 38, and just as I finished going through them, my eye fell on a scratching made with a sharp point on the edge of the border. It was simply the number XXXVIII in Roman numerals. To cut the matter short, there was a similar note, as I may call it, in each of the other lights, and that made it plain to me that the glass painter had had very strict orders from Abbot Thomas about the inscription, and had taken pains to get it correct. Well, after that discovery, you may imagine how minutely I went over the whole surface of the glass in search of further light. Of course, I did not neglect the inscription on the scroll of Zechariah. Upon one stone are 7 eyes. But I quickly concluded that this must refer to some mark on a stone which could only be found in situ, where the treasure was concealed. To be short, I made all possible notes and sketches and tracings, and then came back to Parsbury to work out the cipher at leisure. Oh, the agonies I went through! I thought myself very clever at first, for I made sure that the key would be found in some of the old books on secret writing. The Steganographia of Joachim Traithemus, who was an early contemporary of Abbot Thomas, seemed particularly promising, so I got that, and Silenius's Cryptographia, and Bacon De Augmentis Scientifium, and some more. But I could hit upon nothing. Then I tried the principle of the most frequent letter, taking first Latin, then German as a basis. That didn't help either. Whether it ought to have done so, I am not clear. Then I came back to the window itself and read over my notes, hoping almost against hope, as the abbot might himself have somewhere supplied the key I wanted. I could make nothing out of the color or the pattern of the robes. There were no landscape backgrounds with subsidiary objects. There was nothing in the canopies. The only resource possible seemed to be in the attitudes of the figures. Job, I read, scroll in left hand, forefinger of right hand extended upwards. John holds inscribed book in left hand, with right hand blesses with 2 fingers. Zechariah, scroll in left hand, right hand extended upwards, as Job, but with 3 fingers pointing up. In other words, I reflected, Job has 1 finger extended. John has 2. Zechariah has 3. May not there be a numeral key concealed in that, my dear Gregory? Said Mr. Somerton, laying his hand on his friend's knee. That was the key. I didn't get it at to fit at first, but after 2 or 3 trials I saw what was meant. After the first letter of the inscription, you skip 1 letter. After the next, you skip 2. And after that, skip 3. Now look at the result I got. I underlined the letters which form words, and the underlined words are DECIMALIAT. Do you see it? Decimilia ori reposita sunt in puto in at. 10,000 pieces of gold are laid up in a well in, followed by an incomplete word beginning at. So far, so good. I tried the same plan with the remaining letters, but it wouldn't work. I fancied that perhaps the placing of dots after the 3 letters might indicate some difference of procedure. Then I thought to myself, wasn't there some allusion to a well in the account of Abbot Thomas in that book, the Serium? Yes, there was. He built a putius in atro, a well in the court. There, of course, was my word, atro. The next step was to copy out the remaining letters of the inscription, omitting those I had already used. That gave what you will see on this slip, which I don't know if I want to read it all. RVIOPDOOSMVVISBTAOTTHIEAMLSIVSPDEERSETALQDVA IMLEATTHOOVMCA.H.Q.E. Now I knew what the first 3 letters I wanted were, namely Rio, to complete the word Atiro, as you will see, these are all to be found in the first 5 letters. I was a little confused at first by the occurrence of 2 I's, but very soon I saw that every alternate letter must be taken in the remainder of the inscription. You can work it out for yourself. The result, continuing where the first round left off, is this: Rio Dominus Avitellius de Steinfeld a me, Toma, quil posulia, custodium super gade eque la toch. So the whole secret was out. 10,000 pieces of gold are laid up in the well in the court of the abbot's house of Steinfeld by me, Thomas, who have set a guardian over them. Gara a cure la torch. The last words I ought to say are a device which Abbot Thomas had adopted. I found it with his arms in another piece of glass at Lord D's, and he drafted it bodily into his cipher, though it doesn't quite fit in point of grammar. Well, what would any human being have been tempted to do, my dear Gregory, in my place? Could he have helped setting off, as I did, to Steinfeld, and tracing the secret literally to the fountainhead? I don't believe he could. Anyhow, I couldn't. And as I needn't tell you, I found myself at Steinfeld as soon as the resources of civilization could put me there, and installed myself to the inn you saw. I must tell you that I was not altogether free from forebodings. On one hand, of disappointment, on the other, of danger. There was always the possibility that Abbot Thomas's well might have been wholly obliterated, or else that someone, ignorant of cryptograms and guided only by luck, might have stumbled on the treasure before me. And then there was a very perceptible shaking of the voice here. I was not entirely easy, I need not mind confessing, as to the meaning of the words about the guardian of the treasure. But if you don't mind, I'll say no more about that until until it becomes necessary. At the first possible opportunity, Brown and I began exploring the place. I had naturally represented myself as being interested in the remains of the abbey, and we could not avoid paying a visit to the church, impatient as I was to be elsewhere. Still, it did interest me to see the windows where the glass had been, and especially that at the east end of the south aisle. In the tracery lights of that I was startled to see. Excuse me. In the tracery lights of that I was startled to see some fragments and coats of arms remaining. Abbot Thomas's shield was there, and a small figure with a scroll inscribed Oculis habent et non videbunt. They have eyes and shall not see, which I take it was a hint of the abbot at his canons. But of course the principal object was to find the abbot's house. There was no prescribed place for this, so far as I know, in the plan of a monastery. You can't predict of it, as you can of the chapter house, that it will be on the eastern side of the cloister, or as of the dormitory, that it will communicate with the transept of the church. I felt that if I asked many questions I might awaken lingering memories of the treasure, and I thought it best to try first to discover it for myself. It was not a very long or difficult search. That three-sided court southeast of the church, with deserted piles of buildings around it, and grass-grown pavement, which you saw this morning, was the place. And glad enough I was to see that it was put to no use. It was neither very far from our inn, nor overlooked by any inhabited building. There were only orchards and paddocks on the slopes east of the church. I can tell you the fine stone glowed wonderfully in the rather watery yellow sunset that we had on the Tuesday afternoon. Next, what about the well? There was not much doubt about that, as you can testify. It really is a very remarkable thing. That curve is, I think, of Italian marble, and the carving I thought must be Italian also. There were reliefs, you will perhaps remember, of Eliza and Rebecca, and of Jacob opening the well for Rachel, and similar subjects. But by way of disarming suspicion, I suppose, the abbot had carefully abstained from any of his cynical and elusive inscriptions. I examined the whole structure with the keenest interest, of course. A square well-head with an opening in one side, an arch over it with a wheel for the rope to pass over, evidently in very good condition still, for it had been used within 60 years, or perhaps even later, though not quite recently. Then there was the question of depth and access to the interior. I suppose the depth was about 60 to 70 feet, and as to the other point, it really seemed as if the abbot had wished to lead searchers up to the very door of his treasure house, for as you tested for yourself, there was big blocks of stone bound into the masonry, and leading down in a regular staircase round and round the inside of the well. It seemed almost too good to be true. I wondered if there was a trap, if the stones were so contrived as to tip over when a weight was placed on them. But I tried a good many with my own weight and with my stick, and all seemed, and actually were, perfectly firm. Of course, I resolved that Brown and I would make an experiment that very night. I was well prepared, knowing the sort of place I should have to explore. I had brought a sufficiency of good rope, and bands of webbing to surround my body, and crossbars to hold to, as well as lanterns and candles and crowbars, all of which would go into a single carpet bag and excite no suspicion. I satisfied myself that my rope would be long enough, that the wheel for the bucket was in good working order, and then we went home to dinner. I had a little cautious conversation with the landlord, and made out that he would not be overmuch surprised if I went out for a stroll with my man about 9 o'clock to make, heaven forgive me, a sketch of the abbey by moonlight. I asked no questions about the well, and am not likely to do so now. I fancy I know as much about it as anyone in Steinfeld, at least. With a strong shudder, I I don't want to know anymore. Another drink. Excuse me. Now we come to the crisis. And though I hate to think of it, I feel sure, Gregory, that it will be better for me in all ways to recall it just as it happened. We started, Brown and I, at about 9 with our bag, and attracted no attention, for we managed to slip out at the hinder end of the inn yard into an alley which brought us quite to the edge of the village. In 5 minutes we were at the well, and for some little time we sat on the edge of the well head to make sure that no one was stirring or spying on us. All we heard was some horses cropping grass, out of sight farther down the eastern slope. We were perfectly unobserved, and had plenty of light from the gorgeous full moon to allow us to get the rope properly fitted over the wheel. And I secured the band round my body beneath the arms. We attached the end of the rope very securely to a ring in the stonework. Brown took the lighted lantern and followed me. I had a crowbar. And so we began our descent cautiously, feeling every step before we set foot on it, and scanning the walls in search of any marked stone. Half aloud I counted the steps as we went down, and we got as far as the 38th before I noticed anything at all irregular in the surface of the masonry. Even here there was no mark, and I began to feel very blank and to wonder if the abbot's cryptogram could possibly be an elaborate hoax. At the 49th step the staircase ceased. It was with a very sinking heart that I began retracing my steps, and when I was back on the 38th, Brown with the lantern being a step or two above me, I scrutinized a little bit of irregularity in the stonework with all my might, but there was no vestige of a mark. Then it struck me that the texture of the surface looked just a little smoother than the rest, or at least in some way different. It might possibly be cement and not stone. I gave it a good blow with my iron bar. There was a decidedly hollow sound. That might be the result of our being in a well. But there was more. A great flake of cement dropped on to my feet. I saw marks on the stone underneath. I had tracked the abbot down, my dear Gregory. Even now I think of it with certain pride. It took but a very few more taps to clear the whole of the cement away, and I saw a slab of stone about 2 feet square upon which was engraved a cross. Disappointment again, but only for a moment. It was you, Brown, who reassured me by a casual remark. You said, if I remember right, "It's a funny cross. Looks like a lot of eyes." I snatched the lantern out of your hand and saw with inexpressible pleasure that the cross was composed of 7 eyes. 4 in a vertical line, 3 horizontal. The last of the scrolls in the window was explained in the way I had anticipated. Here was my stone with the 7 eyes. So far the abbot's data had been exact, and as I thought of this, the anxiety about the guardian returned upon me with increased force. Still, I wasn't going to retreat now. Without giving myself time to think, I knocked away the cement all round the marked stone. Then gave it a prise on the right side with my crowbar. It moved at once, and I saw that it was but a thin, light slab, such as I could easily lift out myself, and that it stopped the entrance to a cavity. I did lift it out unbroken and set it on the step, for it might be very important to us to be able to replace it. Then I waited for several minutes on the step just above. I don't know why, but I think to see if any dreadful thing would rush out. Nothing happened. Next, I lit a candle and very cautiously I placed it inside the cavity, with some idea of seeing whether there was foul air and of gaining a glimpse of what was inside. There was some foulness of air which nearly extinguished the flame, but in no long time it burned quite steadily. The hole went some little way back, and also on the right and left of the entrance, and I could see some rounded, light-colored objects within, which might be bags. There was no use in waiting. I faced the cavity, looked in. There was nothing immediately in front of the hole. I put my arm in and felt to the right, very gingerly. Excuse me. Just give me a glass of cognac, Brown. I'll go on in a moment, Gregory. Well, I felt to the right, and my fingers touched something curved that felt, yes, more or less like leather. Dampish it was, and evidently part of a heavy, full thing. There was nothing, I must say, to alarm one. I grew bolder, and putting both hands in as well as I could, I pulled it to me, and it came. It was heavy, but moved more easily than I had expected. As I pulled it towards the entrance, my left elbow knocked over and extinguished the candle. I got the thing fairly in front of the mouth and began drawing it out. Just then Brown gave a sharp ejaculation and ran quickly up the steps with the lantern. He will tell you why in a moment. Startled as I was, I looked round after him and saw him stand for a minute at the top and then walk away a few yards. Then I heard him call softly, "All right, sir." I went on pulling out the great bag in complete darkness. It hung for an instant on the edge of the hole. And slipped forward onto my chest. And put its arms round my neck. My dear Gregory, I am telling you the exact truth. I believe I am now acquainted with the extremity of terror and repulsion which a man can endure without losing his mind. I can only just manage to tell you now the bare outline of the experience. I was conscious of the most horrible smell of mold and of a cold kind of face pressed against my own and moving slowly over it, and of several I don't know how many legs or arms or tentacles or something clinging to my body. I screamed out, Brown says, like a beast, and fell away backward from the step on which I stood, and the creature slipped downwards, I suppose, onto that same step. Providentially, the band round me held firm. Brown did not lose his head and was strong enough to pull me up to the top and get me over the edge quite promptly. How he managed it exactly, I don't know, and I think he would find it hard to tell you. I believe he contrived to hide our implements in the deserted building nearby, and with very great difficulty he got me back to the inn. I was in no state to make explanations, and Brown knows no German, but next morning I told the people some tale of having had a bad fall in the Abbey ruins, which I suppose they believed. And now, before I go further, I should just like you to hear what Brown's experiences during those few minutes were. Tell the rector, Brown, what you told me. Well, sir, said Brown, speaking low and nervously, it was just this way. Master was busy down in front of the hole, and I was holding the lantern and looking out, when I heard something drop in the water from the top, as I thought. So I look up, and I see someone's head looking over at us. I suppose I must have said something, and I held the light up and run up the steps, and my light shone right on the face. Oh, that's a bad one, sir, if I ever see one. Oldish man, and the face very much fell in, and laughing, as I thought. And I got up the steps as quick, pretty nigh, as I'm telling you. When I was out on the ground, there weren't a sign of any person. And there hadn't been the time for anyone to get any away, let alone old chap. And I made sure he weren't catching down by the well, nor nothing. Next thing I hear Master cry out something horrible, and all I see was him hanging out by the rope. And as Master says, however I got him up, I couldn't tell you. You hear that, Gregory? Said Mr. Somerton. Now, does any explanation of that incident strike you? The whole thing is so ghastly and abnormal, I must own it puts me quite off my balance. But the thought did occur to me that possibly the person who set the trap might have come to see the success of his plan. Just so, Gregory. Just so. I can think of nothing else so likely. I should say, if such a word had a place anywhere in my story, I think it must have been the abbot. Well, I haven't much more to tell you. I spent a miserable night. Brown sitting up with me. The next day I was no better, unable to get up, no doctor to be had, and if one had been available, I doubt he would have done much for me. I made Brown write off to you and spent a second terrible night in Gregory. Of this I am sure. I think it affected me more than the first shock, for it lasted longer. There was someone or something on the watch outside my door the whole night. I always fancied there were two. It wasn't only the faint noises I heard from time to time all through the dark hours, but there was the smell, the hideous smell of mold. Every rag I had on me on that first evening I had stripped off and made Brown take it away. I believe he stuffed the things into the stove in his room, yet the smell was there, as intense as it had been in the well. What is more, it came from outside the door. But with the first glimmer of dawn it faded out and the sound ceased too, and that convinced me that the thing, or things, were creatures of darkness, and could not stand the daylight. So I was sure that if anyone, could put back the stone, it or they would be powerless until someone else took it away again. I had to wait until you came to get that done. Of course, I couldn't send Brown to do it by himself, and still less could I tell anyone who belonged to the place. Well, there's my story. And if you don't believe it, I can't help it, but I think you do. Indeed, said Mr. Gregory. I can find no alternative. I must believe it. I saw the well in the stone myself, and at a glimpse I thought of the bags or something else in the hole. To be plain with you, Summerton, I believe my door was watched last night too. I dare say it was, Gregory. Thank goodness that is over. Have you, by the way, anything to tell about your visit to that dreadful place? Very little, was the answer. Brown and I managed easily enough to get the slab into its place, and he fixed it very firmly with the irons and wedges you had desired him to get, and he contrived to smear the surface with mud so that it looked just like the rest of the wall. One thing I did notice in the carving on the wall head, which I think must have escaped you. It was a horrible, grotesque shape, perhaps more like a toad than anything else, and there was a label by it inscribed with two words: Depositum Custode. Keep that which is committed to thee. And that was the treasure of Abbot Thomas. I think, my dear scholars, that will be the last story for this night. Thank you for coming. So for the rest of the week, so Tuesday, we will be continuing our playthrough of Amnesia, The Dark Descent. And look forward to some new spookies from the shore. Not spookies from the shores. A spooky from the study. There'll be two of them next week. One on Tuesday, one on Thursday, both on my YouTube channel. So then, my dear scholars, let's see if there is anyone we can raid tonight. Hmm, dear. We might. Let me see if there's anyone writing a read. We might not be able to. So, my dear scholars, I think tonight we will simply close down. So, my dear scholars, I say unto you, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, till we meet each other again at the study. Take care, and I shall see you next time. Till then, farewell and bye bye.